is a rapid increase, the World Bank would say, or the G20 would say, an existential threat to humanity from pandemics, and that they're increasing due to various reasons, particularly because there's an increase in, it is claimed, passage of diseases from animals to humans. And this is an increasing threat that the world has to address. We're looking at the evidence that it's based on, concentrating on the evidence that is used by the WHO, World Bank, G20 Secretariat and others to support that narrative.
Hi, I'm Dr. Randy Bach. I'm honored today to have with us Dr. David Bell. He's the public health physician in the world I trust the most. And he's an expert in tropical medicine and formerly with the WHO. Currently, he's working on a project called REPPARE, which almost spelled the right way. It's not quite. It's more like REPPARE in Italian. And it's out of Leeds, University of Leeds in the UK. And he'll tell us about that, what the acronym stands for. It has something to do with a review of pandemic, how we did in the last pandemic, how we'll do for future ones, and what we have on the plate to keep the pandemic industry alive and well, although not necessarily the rest of us. So, David, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Randy.
Tell us what is REPPARE, REPPARE, and how did you come up with that formulation? Why did you need to form it, and what are the mechanisms behind it?
Yeah, so it's a project of the University of Leeds. It's an independent project there. We're looking at the evidence base of the pandemic agenda. So if you work in international public health, pandemics are the biggest thing for the last several years. Everyone knows COVID, obviously, but it's a continuing, you call it an industry. I mean, it's capturing a huge part of the funding and most of the emphasis in public health. So, and this is for a number of reasons, ostensibly that there is a rapid increase, the World Bank would say, or the G20 would say, an existential threat to humanity from pandemics, and that they're increasing due to various reasons, particularly because there's an increase in, it is claimed, passage of diseases from animals to humans. And this is an increasing threat that the world has to address. And WHO's had the pandemic agreement recently, the amendments to international health regulations. World Bank's got a pandemic fund. They're talking about over $30 billion a year, up to 40 if you follow the World Bank's reasoning, to address this globally. And that's sort of 10 times what the WHO gets at the moment for all its operations. So this is a dominant theme, and we're looking at the evidence that it's based on, concentrating on the evidence that is used by the WHO, World Bank, G20 Secretariat and others to support that narrative, and at their claims on return on investment. So if you put in this many dollars, they claim in 2022 that you get 300 to 700 times that back, which is an unbelievably good investment. So we're looking at the basis of that, whether it makes sense. And going on from that, how these decisions are made is, we've put out a number of reports that have shown that their own data, their own citations don't support or frequently contradict these claims. So it's a concern. There's a lot of money to be made from pandemics, which is probably not disconnected from the whole thing. And the change in the way that international public health works over the last 25 years, which is related. If you look at WHO, their funding has shifted from mainly countries giving money to a big pot where they decide what's best to do with it, to a system where 80% of their funding almost is earmarked for specific projects of the funder. So they're just a tool of the funder. And an increasing part of that funding has been from the private sector. The largest single funder is now the Gates Foundation. as of this year. So, and then alongside that, you have public-private partnerships like Gavi for vaccines, CEPI for vaccines in pandemics, which have been started over the last couple of decades. And the model is that you use particularly public money from countries, but you have private people on the board who decide how to spend that money, and they're representatives by and large of the vaccine industry, of the pharmaceutical industry. So, or very strongly dominated by them. So they will decide, obviously, because they have to use that public money for the purposes of increasing their company's profitability, because that's what you do when you're in a company. That's your job. So we've designed a system that's sort of self-perpetuating, where pandemics, which we have found in our looking at the data, a tiny fraction of global mortality, but which these institutions are claiming are a very large part of it. Essentially, all the incentives are there that this becomes the dominant theme in global health, the dominant use of money, and the mRNA vaccines are part of this 100-day vaccine program at CEPI, which is publicly funded. Manufacturers are obviously on board because they could see the hundreds of billions that they make in this sort of model from COVID. And it's sort of setting us up for a health emergency future, which is probably going to be a net, very significant harm globally to public health. And that's not that hard to show, because all this effort takes away from where people can actually benefit. So we're looking at this and trying to, based purely on evidence and not on opinion at all, show whether this makes sense, and if not, try to convince people to do better, which we need to, because we still have major problems in health in the world that could benefit from the billions that are being wasted on this.
No, you bring up a lot of excellent points, and I want to let you get to your REPPARE project, but a few things pop into mind. The World Bank and this investment in people. They never run the counterfactual. I mean, real banks are there to kind of hold your money, facilitate money transfer, help grow the community. You don't have mortgages without banks. Not everyone needs his money at the same time. Somebody's elderly, wants to make money on his investment. Somebody young needs the money to borrow to build a business, and that's how society keeps going. It's a bank. We're not bees or ants, but we have a colony. We need different people to do different things at different times, and a bank helps facilitate that. We don't, work like on pheromones the way ants do, but we work on signals, and those are interest rates and loanability, credit score, and all that kind of stuff. So a real bank does that. The World Bank, when we talk about these profits and on a particular quote unquote investment, people in the private sector are always talking about the investment. When you have taxes, it's they call it revenue, and what's your return on investment and so forth. That's not really quite the same thing. These things are kind of imperious and official and officious at the same time, and they're making these judgments, and they don't have no way of backing it up. They're not going to give you a report 5 years later and say we lost money because we invested in coronavirus versus malaria or something like that. You're not going to get the counterfactual, and you're not going to see a return, real return investment, because it's going to be nebulous. Whether some country is more educated or not, that has a greater GDP or something like that. But you're not going to be able to see as compared to what. So this is really hard to do data analysis when you don't have good data and you don't have ways of backing it up and so forth. So that's just one little thing comes to mind. But I think the tried and true. I think you're pointing out some reasonable fault lines in the procedure. I mean, we don't necessarily want private companies to make money on the backs of misguided policy. On the other hand, the public entities don't do so well either, because they don't necessarily have anybody to pay attention to. They don't have necessarily an economically based board of directors. So you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, or two hard places. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that falls down though. I mean, there's a couple of things there. Yeah, and the World Bank is very different, and in a normal bank, in theory, in a private bank, you have to only give out loans where you think you end up making a profit. So you only give them to people who you think are going to pay back and be successful. So you fund potentially successful projects. Although we know, the too big to fail bit, 2008, etc., we discovered that actually they'll just be bailed out with taxpayers' money anyway. But the World Bank is even more in that direction. So if they want more money, they don't have to find some good loans they gave out that they are being paid back. They just go and ask the government for more money and get some. So it's a very different model. It's more a conduit for funding to a large extent. They do give loans, but no one expects a lot of these or most of these loans to ever be paid back. But with a private business, I mean, you're right. There's good reasons to use people with private business acumen in making these decisions, because if you're in a bureaucracy and the bureaucracy, say like WHO, has been there for 80 years almost, then it becomes ossified. People are interested in, not in the mission, but in the institution and in their potential pensions and their health care, their kids' school subsidies, etc. This is reality, and living in a nice place like Geneva. So you want to keep that job, and so the incentives become to look after the organisation and not to be really efficient in the use of public funds to help the maximum number of people in sub-Saharan Africa or Asia or somewhere. So, but having said that, and that was part of the argument for the public-private partnerships. The problem is that a company can only really participate significantly in a public-private partnership if they think they'll make money out of it. Because they can't go in wasting their investors' money on some nice altruistic feel-goody type thing that, like, training some more health workers and helping with some nutrition in Malawi or Zambia or something. If you're Pfizer CEO, that's not going to help your bottom line. It's not going to help return on investment for investors or the salaries of your executives. But making sure that the WHO buys more vaccines and gives recommendations that push the vaccine agenda and increase your market share is exactly what you're paid to do. So the problem with the public-private partnerships, the theory was that you bring in more business acumen and more focus. The reality is that you turn public health into a for-profit machine for large multinational companies, and it's inevitable that is going to happen. So, and that is really, it explains, I think, mainly the change in focus of global health from, say, the 1980s, 90s to where we are now, which is all health emergencies, health security agenda, and that translates into vaccine sales.
Yeah, and I watched a couple of those videos. Marianne DeBasey was the narrator. She did a great job. And there's the, I think it's even Cowgirls Get the Blues, the book, the novel from 40 years ago. Every chapter starts out, the situation was desperate as usual. It seems, that we're continually kind of whipped into the state of fear, and it's not one thing, it's another. Or as one of my friends said, it's not one thing, it's your mother. But either way, Lassa fever, Congo, this and that, Rift Valley, then there's this disease X, which I don't know if it's the number 10 or, the X as a mystery, X on the treasure map. But there's 10 diseases of note for which we should maintain kind of eternal vigilance and concern. And I'll just give this one preface. I apologize. But as you know, I have kind of a stake in this. Frankly, probably a grilled medium rare steak churrascuro because it's in Brazil.
It includes Zika.
Yeah, Zika, and that's one of the 10. And it has not still yet been debunked by the Academy, although it has been by me. Again, I believe Zika is a real virus. It's a dengue virus, but none of the dengue viruses ever cause microcephaly, which is also a real phenomenon, but has multiple causes, including genetic and who knows what. And it doesn't really change that much in incidence, and it didn't really change that much even in that supposed pandemic year. And it hasn't gone up ever since anywhere else on Earth, including Northeast Brazil, where supposedly was the epicenter. And so I have this book. Nobody's really looked at it. I got published in the AJ, American Journal of Medicine once, but it's still on that list. So I think they have a tendency to ignore the counter, the things that counter their narratives. And again, these other ones,
Yeah.
Rift Valley, I assume it's for the, Rift Valley in East Africa, and the Lassa fever. I mean, that sounds African, and a lot Congo, whatever. How much of these things are actual concerns? And just one other, preface
Mm.
is that one of my articles in Brownstone was on Donald McNeil, who was the chief science editor, kind of writer for the New York Times for a long period of time, and he was the one who literally wrote the book on Zika, and literally wrote the authoritative piece to quote unquote go medieval on coronavirus, which got everyone in a tizzy in New York City, which was essentially the epicenter for phase one of the COVID illness and the COVID overkill and the COVID terror and all that kind of stuff misapplied. And so he was central in that. And part of his writings all along the way was the fact that we are going to have these tropical illnesses come up and climb up like you're falling into quicksand. We were basically succumbing
Yeah.
because of global warming and climate change and whatnot. The whole world is going to turn to a place where we get dengue and we get these illnesses. And this is part of the general. I
Yeah.
think they were kind of tandemized, tied together as twins, climate theory and this, disease stuff, and the tropical illnesses in particular, because we don't see them, we don't have them here right at hand. You're going to be extra scared of them because guess what? The big bad climate monster is going to, turn you into the Congo.
Yeah, and it's a funny thing. Infectious disease is going down. It's been going down for a century. It's steadily going down now. If you look at mortality for infectious disease, it popped up a bit, during COVID. It got all the way back to where we were in 2010. So it's a tiny little blip in the inexorable downward trend of infectious disease mortality globally, and that is despite the world's population increasing. So this is actual deaths. So you're talking about that list of diseases. That's the R&D list, priority list of the WHO for pandemics and epidemics. And yeah, it has COVID there, which is almost certainly from a lab. It's generally accepted now. So it shouldn't really be on the list. Then it has Lassa fever, which is transmitted by a rat that's endemic to West Africa and Central Africa. So it won't move from there. And every year it's bad disease. It's about 5,000 deaths on average or so, which is nothing compared to malaria, TB, HIV, etc. But it's not zero. Ebola, which we've had one outbreak ever over 10,000 deaths in the world that we know of. And then there's no other disease on that list that is over 1,000 people, 1,000 deaths recorded in human history. Even like it's got SARS, MERS, they're about 750, 800 each. Crimea, Congo, hemorrhagic fever, Zika, which you mentioned, and there's big questions, as you rightly point out, whether it even caused microcephaly, but it certainly didn't cause much death, and the problem has gone away. If there was a problem, it was because it was then entering South America where there was a lack of immunity. Now there is. It was endemic in Africa and elsewhere. So there is nothing on that list that would logically cause you much concern. And there's no reason why it will get worse now when healthcare is getting better, medicine's getting better, economies are getting better. And so this is, if you're in public health, you can sort of investigate outbreaks in, diarrhea from a few people went to a restaurant. It's pretty boring, but it's what it is. Or you can get excited about, theoretical things like pandemics or meteorite strikes. And you can get that funded, then why wouldn't you do it? And I think that's where we are. With Zika, you mentioned, I think there's still about 200 million, isn't there, in funding earmarked for it,
Absolutely.
for a vaccine.
Yeah.
So if you're running a research lab doing vaccines, you will work on Zika, not because we need a Zika vaccine, we don't appear to at all, but because there's $200 million sitting there
It's waiting. It's waiting. No,
and waiting. And what do you do? The main purpose of running a lab is to employ your staff. Yeah, it is it is because they have kids in school, they have mortgages to pay, all the rest of it. So, if you're the head of a lab team, your main concern, what keeps you up at night or something, is making sure that all your people don't get sacked because you run out of money at the end of the year. That's the main problem, isn't it? So, your primary purpose, as like running a company, is to stay afloat. So you'll go where the money is, and if there's a philanthropist who's really interested in showing that climate change is going to massively increase infectious disease, or that we desperately need more vaccines for the following list of 10 diseases, then you'll find a way to justify that, because otherwise you'll never get the funding.
That's a reasonable point. I was speaking with John Baudouin. It's kind of the French Baudouin, but he says it Americanized. And he's the author of The Real CDC. And he needed to get some stuff from the state of Massachusetts, and he asked Freedom of Information to get some death certificates because he thinks the COVID diagnoses were exaggerated. And apparently he didn't get it. But then he said he was looking at climate change and something else. And all of a sudden, he got all the data he wanted. He just had to ask in a different way.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. The climate is changing, and malaria is an interesting one. It is officially now said by the WHO, on the basis of no good evidence, that climate change is driving the increase in malaria. Climate change is undoubtedly driving an increase in the altitude at which you can get malaria in Papua New Guinea and Ethiopia, because it warms a bit, and so mosquitoes can live a bit higher up the mountains. But where you would expect it to have the most effect is temperate countries.
Yeah, they were swampy before, they're swampy now.
Yeah, and that is where we're successfully eliminating malaria at the moment.
Right.
So, the malaria is increasing in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, because of resistance to insecticides of the mosquitoes. Mm-hmm. Some early but growing resistance to antimalarial drugs. The diagnostics are working less well because of a change in the parasite genome, etc. So, and just poverty and civil war and all the things that, it's a disease of poverty in the end.
Right. So
there's all these other reasons, and climate change is the least likely and with the least evidence of any of these.
Yeah, no, I think it has to do with civilization and the lack thereof. I think, most of the great public health leaps in, sanitation and in longevity, all that kind of stuff, have to do with engineering, cohesion, diminished war, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Which is nutrition and living conditions, sanitation, which will come with what you're saying.
I think penicillin.
You can run a sewer system if you're in a civil war and you have no money. It just doesn't work. So
it's kind of ironic because I was in a discussion the other day with a gentleman who felt he was very concerned about one particular public health aspect. And he said that if he didn't get that the society, he just assumes society unravel because they're not buying into this particular public health thrust. And even stipulating he's right, public health worsens when you get rid of governments. We look at Libya, Syria, the Congo, or the various Congos. There's two of them at least. The real health outcome has to do with being in a place that is reasonably stable and has civil society. And even within the context of those, you can, devolve. And, it's not any better if frankly, it's probably worse if you have, death by having your throat slit, in a murder, robbery, whatever, than getting malaria. I mean, I'd probably rather die by malaria, but who knows? Maybe the other one's short and sweet. But there are a lot of different ways to die. And most of them have the common pathway that they occur with lack of civility, whether it's the murders, terrorism, wars, all that kind of stuff, or the fact you don't have a society that can provide the standard basics we seem to take for granted. Food, adequate food, water, Zoom, internet, a whole bunch of things that keep us happy, fed. The greatest kind of boon in civilization has been the speed of communication. So if there's a good idea, it can pass around really fast. conversely, there are a lot of bad ideas that get passed around really fast. And there's, kind of, I think, an internal war between the people who have been in power. I kind of call it the Wizard of Oz syndrome. The Wizard of Oz, I think, frankly, more benign than a lot of our more recent wizards like Fauci and whatnot. Now, the Wizard of Oz was not a wizard, but he kept control by his, big voice, amplified by megaphone and whatnot. And frankly, Oz is probably a better place than what Dr. Fauci left us under COVID. But in either case, the way that some of the elites keep power is not because they're bigger or stronger than us, because they have us befuddled and whipping around against each other and following certain trends and buying into, say, the sixth or seventh COVID vaccine, whatever, which keeps some of their cronies, also well fed and whatnot. I don't know. Any comments on that?
You said a lot.
Well, we can skip over that, but why don't we talk a little bit what repair is and what it will repair.
Yeah.
And I have a math professor friend, and we've had this back and forth kind of text, which somewhat petered out since the last few months. But was the vaccine worse than the illness? Were the responses to COVID appropriate? Could we have gotten by without them? What would the world have been like had we treated it just like a bad flu? And was it, kind of like on the realm of being, I hate to use the word evil, but malicious or ill-advised to go down the kind of, I think, draconian overkill kind of zero COVID route that China did originally and that we seem to have replicated?
Yeah, so, and repair hasn't looked so much at COVID. We have a bit, but we're mainly looking sort of forward at, what do we do now? Because this is, the world is seeing COVID, but from a public health point of view, the response is still there. This is the intended response for the future. We'd be looking at, what is the evidence from COVID to justify that change in response? And there is very little good evidence at all. It's the overwhelming data is that masks made very little difference. The overwhelming data is that having a curfew from 9 in the evening to 6 in the morning doesn't stop a virus from circulating, etc., which isn't surprising. WHO knew this before COVID. Everyone at WHO knows it now, but the way that funding works, as I said, makes it very difficult for the organisation to actually act in a honest way regarding public health. But one area we have looked at in that project is at the global burden of disease, which we discussed earlier. The global burden of disease program is the gold standard for the world in how many people die from each disease. So if you want to know how many people dying globally from diabetes or heart attacks or strokes or tuberculosis, you go to the site at Institute for Health Metrics Evaluations at IHME at University of Washington. It's a Gates Foundation sponsored group. And this is, they work closely with the Lancet, they work a bit with WHO. This is accepted as essentially the global standard. So they came out over the last couple of years with a number of publications which together summarize their estimates of the COVID burden for 2020, 2021. So it's the first time we've had COVID in these, what were gold standard disease metrics. So it's interesting that they came with, to us, were very surprising figures. You end up with it's about 13 or 12 million COVID deaths, which is it's about twice what WHO recorded for that period. Out of about 15.9 total excess deaths. So total excess deaths are probably, they make sense. You have a rough idea of how many people died in the world, and this is a big increase. 2019, there was about 57 million deaths globally is the estimate. And then 2020, about 63.1 million, 2021, about 67.9. So this is an increase of 10%, over 10%, and then another increase of over 7%. And even if you age standardized and so on, it's about the same numbers. So they record a big increase, which is probably correct, in deaths during the first 2 years of the COVID outbreak. So what are these from? And if you look at recorded deaths from COVID, it's a small minority, it's a minority of that. And they put their figures are quite different. They show 4.8 million and 7.9 million deaths in 2020, 2021 from COVID. So they say that the vast majority of that 15.9 million was COVID. And so we looked into hundreds of pages of supplementary data on how they got this. And it's interesting. It's really interesting because people need to understand how these numbers work. And it's important because now the WHO says what global burden of disease is. Our World in Data, which is a website a lot of people go to for data, they reflect the same numbers because people assume that the GBD is the gold standard. So for COVID, they have taken, where countries like the United States have a very high burden, they just take that as it is. They don't look at, there's a paper that came out today from Germany that suggests that only 14%, 1/4 of PCR positive cases actually had a serology positive marker that suggested they were really infected. There's a recent one from Greece that showed 40% probably of cases were real and the rest not. There's regional studies in the US that show the same thing, that a very large part of the reported COVID burden were not COVID. Plus, there's questions, did they really die of COVID versus diabetes versus renal failure, etc. So COVID in a lot of high-income countries is almost certainly overstated. It's based on a PCR test and a death, not COVID symptoms. So they take them without question as COVID deaths. And then they go to countries that have very few deaths, like sub-Saharan Africa, or reported very few deaths. And they have a model that changes the numbers. And this is based on a series of parameters, such as did they use masks? And they assume, quote unquote, masks are incredibly effective at stopping COVID transmission, which all the solid data out there says not that they may work a little bit, probably in a general community, it's not at all. So if they didn't use many masks, then the model increases the COVID deaths over reported. Did they use vaccines? And they assume, for instance, the Moderna start off with 97% efficacy against severe disease, and Pfizer 95%. And they weigh in on Omicron to about 78%. These are way higher than I think even the manufacturers claim now. And there are studies after studies out there showing that over 7 or 8 months you can even get negative efficacy. It doesn't commit to it. And then they have much, much lower efficacy for post-infection protection, which CDC showed is actually slightly better than the vaccines. So they have just to go back to the mask one, incredibly effective. That's based on 2 studies. One is a Facebook self-reporting survey for mask rates. The other one for the efficacy is there's a German study early on where they looked at 4 weeks of COVID deaths, 2 weeks before the mask mandate, 2 weeks after. And there was a drop, so they said the mask mandate works, masks work. Whereas, they introduced masks at the top of an epidemic curve, which was going down then. So both studies, they only have 2 studies to support this incredibly effective claim, but both of them are highly spurious. So they have a model here, which most people aren't aware of, and I don't think many people in the IHME, the GBD, even understand what is going on, because it's extremely complex. There are thousands of people around the world involved in developing this data. It's the GBD is a huge project. And we talked to a number of people there, and no one really had a handle on exactly what was happening because it's such a
Mhm.
complex, it's just grown and grown. It's such a complex thing. So their model is taking countries like sub-Saharan Africa and saying, well, they didn't use masks and they didn't social distance much. They didn't have many curfews. They
Therefore,
didn't, yeah, they didn't close business or whatever. So therefore, and they didn't have much vaccination, even though WHO has shown nearly everyone in Africa was infected and had post-infection immunity before the vaccine got there. So therefore, lots and lots of people must have died of COVID, even though it wasn't reported. And
yeah,
the importance of this is you have that ceiling of 15.9% million excess deaths over 2 years. So suddenly, the non-COVID part of that, which you could say was the cost of lockdowns, perhaps vaccine side effects or whatever, shrinks because you've increased the COVID portion. Because you're increasing the COVID portion within under that ceiling. So what they're doing with this model is inflating COVID deaths and reducing the potential deaths from lockdowns, from vaccine side effects, etc.
yeah. I
So,
think
and I don't think it's almost not intentional, although putting numbers in there saying masks are incredibly effective when clearly they're not, etc. Is I mean, is it ignorance or is it intent? You can argue, but they are funded by someone who has very large interest in the vaccine industry. I mean, it's not. You could
mhm.
argue either way, but so there are conflicts of interests involved in this, undoubtedly. But um, this is now this is highly spurious. It's based on spurious data from spurious studies and misinterpretation even of them, and then it is now the WHO on the WHO website. It's on our World and Data website. So history will look back and these will be the numbers they use. So we're building a false history of how many people died from COVID and how few people died as collateral damage.
No, it's a sadness. I was trying to think of the right analogy for this phenomenon where they're conflating, imputing, uh, finagling, shenanigans. I can't think of the right verb, but basically, I was thinking, so here you are in, say, northern Minnesota in the winter, and I don't know, an obese population with diabetes. You're finding a certain number of gangrenous frostbite digits lost. So you say, oh, we
Mm.
lost, I don't know, 300 toes last winter to frostbite slash diabetes. And then you go to Western Africa and I don't know, maybe warfare or I don't know, some kind of jungle rot or whatever, and people have lost their toes, and you're like, oh, so that we lost like 400 toes in West Africa, and that must be they're having frostbite, so therefore,
Yeah, you could even say, because it's not very cold, the diabetes must be even worse. That they're losing their toes without, from diabetes without frostbite. There must be a lot of diabetes here because their toes are falling off. It's that is the sort of logic, and because it's so complex, and there are thousands of pages of supplementary data published on this from IHME. No one's got the time to sift through and figure this out.
yeah, that's the saddest. I also think, I wrote an article like 3 years ago called Chat CCP. When Chat GPT was pretty young, I was bumping my head against it trying to get certain answers, which I knew were right answers, and it refused to succumb, and it was just kind of hilarious. And basically, there's kind of a layer in it that wouldn't let you have the right answer, wouldn't let you have the benefit of being right about some mask data or whatever, or Dr. Fauci's being wrong, this and that. And so, what you're talking about here is a very similar situation to the multiplication of LLMs creating history and then making history, absorbing their own false history. So it's kind of like a
Yeah,
castle built on sand. So if the LLMs say, "Oh, David Bell is 4'3", and they say it enough times, and you're not, I've met you, you're taller than I am. But if they say it enough times in the literature, it's going to be David Bell. They have to find the right one. 4'3", famous dwarf, tropical medicine, whatever, famous dwarf. And the more times they say David Bell, famous dwarf, then everyone's like, oh yeah, David, oh that famous dwarf. And then the next generation of LLMs are picking up from other people who've repeated it, and then everybody knows that's the case, and therefore, that's what you are. And it's kind of like we all fight against this kind of reputational bias, and
Yeah.
but it's a Mr. I mean, I think I understand why OpenAI did what it did, because it's run by leftists. I think I understand why it was kind of why the vaccine narrative was part of OpenAI. Why you couldn't say anything on YouTube, you can't say anything on Facebook, you can't say anything on X at the time or Twitter at the time, because that's what they wanted. Certain interests wanted you to have, and it's all part of this concept that the vaccines are the way out of anything. That
Yeah, but what they're doing here is building the thing to get out of. So, once you've inflated COVID like this, and especially in places like sub-Saharan Africa, then where they've got many other things to worry about, then you can use that in the future to justify the investment in future pandemic preparedness. So if you find that COVID killed very few people, which probably the report numbers are overinflated. If you look at what's come out of Greece, the US, and Germany and so on, when people actually audit the data. So it's probably too high. But COVID is one of the key pieces of evidence that is used to justify this whole pandemic industry. So if it goes lower, they lose tens of billions of government money. If it goes higher, they can justify getting that tens of billions. So this is really important to a lot of people in the global health industry, but also in the pharmaceutical industry, that this misrepresentation of truth, of facts, is perpetuated. So all the incentives are to do that. There's no incentives here to tell the truth, because no one, people will gain in Burkina Faso if you tell the truth on this, because they'll get more money for improving their toilets and sanitation and malaria control. But they haven't got a voice at the table.
Yeah.
So they don't sway the World Bank at all. So the people who sway the World Bank are the World Economic Forum, the big companies, the people they go to the club with. And the large European, North American governments have large pharmaceutical industries. So all the incentives are to perpetuate this myth of extreme pandemic and rising pandemic risk.
So how has David Bell managed to stay free and an honest broker?
Well, I'm not alone, which helps a lot, because there are a lot of people who see this. There are much less who speak about it, for all sorts of reasons, but there are a lot who see it. I've been fortunate in that we have had groups like the University of Leeds, and we work also with the University of Ghent in Belgium and so on. There are universities out there that maintain academic integrity, which is all we're doing. We're just telling the truth. We're saying what the data is. And there are people who are willing to fund that, like the Brownstone Institute, who's been funding the research at Leeds. And they're willing to just give the money and not have any say whatsoever on the outcomes. They don't know till they receive from Leeds the results, where the project is going. But they see, there are people out there still who see the academic truth as important. So I've been fortunate that I've been able to be in a group that was interested in that. But a lot of people, there aren't many funders. It's the same in, say, the nutrition, the food industry, where almost all nutrition research now is funded by the food industry. I know of one large university research group who are independently funded. There may be some others, but I don't know of one globally. Science is very much captured now by funders with vested interest in their results. And that either it prevents them from doing work that would show that something contrary to the narrative, or they even change what they're doing to fit the narrative. You know, I think everyone knows about Neil Ferguson at Imperial College, about his funding, which was extremely influential in shutting down countries and eventually having vaccine mandates and large sales of vaccines. So, and he produced data showing that there'll be 500,000 dead in the UK, 3 million dead in the US, etc., from COVID in a short time. At the same time he was doing that, he was publishing in Lancet the data from China that showed that almost no one under 65 died from COVID. And it's Verity et al. He's one of the authors on that paper,
So
published in March 2020. So,
this follow
sorry, I just say that they are heavily funded by the same people who fund the global burden of disease and some others, Koch brothers, I think, and others, but people with a vested interest in what was caused by that blatantly poor quality.
So, kind of like a lull here, but what is the pathway here going forward? And does your work reverberate adequately? Say there's Brownstone doing X, Y, and Z. Theoretically, we have a better administration currently. RFK Jr. as HHS and Jay Bhattacharya at NIH. I guess a separate question would be, we talk about science being captured. The analogy I was thinking of while you were talking about that was, there are some big market football teams, American football, real football. Los Angeles Rams, they've got a big new stadium, $2.1 billion stadium. New York Giants are in, big city. And if this, followed the same logic, they would win all their games. The referees would hand them the ball and whatnot. And I think there are instances where maybe certain teams might be favored a little bit, but in the aggregate, everything's kind of on replay, and it's hard for a referee to be that corrupt. And we can follow the betting markets. We can see if somebody's betting that Terry Rozier fall in the third quarter and he falls in the third quarter, then we go find and indict Terry Rozier. So, in these other things, which are kind of reproducible events in a sense, I mean, they're not fully reproducible. They're different football games, but they play with the same ball, the same field, so forth, some different environments, whatever. But the better teams tend to win because they're better teams, not because the referees, this and that, not so much cheating. Is there a way of kind of putting an adjudicatory aspect, some kind of third party? I have a piece I'm actually working on right now. I might have told you to kind of apply, some of these, kind of external review aspects that we find when we get in an Uber, Airbnb, Google reviews, or whatever, to the actual scientific study, so they can remain truer to their source. And then I have a separate question, so I don't forget, which is the big balloon in deaths. If it wasn't COVID and it was kind of peri-pandemic, was it, food supply disruption, and then the second year after that, the 2021, was that vaccines? Because I'm kind of curious about how much of that's real, what it's attributed to. But anyway, so take either one of those or both.
Yeah, the academic bit, I don't know. I mean, you can have an umpire in the sort of general